make do. I hope you had an enjoyable amount of free time, and I hope you used it to read. All right. Did you read The Brothers Karamazov?
Yes.
Okay. What'd you think?
At least a little bit easier to read than the stuff we've read in the past.
Okay. I mean, it's big, but you can make sense of it, particularly if you have a good English translation. Most of them are reasonably good. Fair enough. What else? Yeah.
I couldn't handle the devil trying to convince Ivan to not believe in God, but to believe in the devil.
There are a lot of people that do, strangely enough. You ever noticed how people get all excited about where evil comes from? Like, that's a big problem in their mind, but nobody wonders, well, where does good come from? All right, nobody has nearly as much energy to spend on that problem. All right, so the problem of evil, fascinating. The problem of good,
Also, the devil turning out to be a Cartesian.
well, of course he is. Without saying. I thought we had covered that under Descartes.
I understand your interpretation of Descartes now.
All right, there we go. It's me, all the way down. The devil, look, in any book we're going to read, if the devil shows up, he's going to be the most interesting character. I don't know why that is. Right? But there is no exception to that rule. If we have a book with the devil in it, the devil is going to get all the best lines. All right? I mean, that's the reason why the Inferno is so much more interesting than the Paradiso, which is this washed out kind of just too much light. You know, I get the idea. You're light, God, and it's really light and all, but it interferes with our distinction between any of the things that are in the light, whereas things are all too distinct in hell. He has clear and distinct ideas there. That's part of his problem. Very few people understand Cartesian jokes. I mean, you've actually gotten to the point where that begins to make sense. Good. All right. It's supposed to have done something to you, this 1,000 pages. What did it do to you? I mean, what do you think? What's your reaction? I mean, some people look at this and say, that's a sick mind. I mean, there's just no way that anybody should be able or want to write a book like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that, like, you know, stepping away from the spiritual and the larger themes of the book, even just the family drama of the novel itself was what struck me. Like, it's just like, how messed up is this family? And so it's great. It feels almost like a reality TV drama, but like, you know, with deadly consequences.
That's actually very well taken.
And I really enjoyed, even just at that very human level, just the relationships and the suffering and the pathos of each character.
The complexity of family life is actually, I mean, this is perhaps a little more complex than we wish, but he gives us a sense of how powerful the emotions surrounding family ties can actually be. I mean, here they've gone bad really quick and really bad, but family life is messy and complicated, as everybody knows, because we all have families, right? One of the things that he's figured out, and I think Dostoevsky is a greater psychologist than Freud could ever hope to be. Right, it's true. And in looking at this, the insights that he had are quite stark, are quite striking. People are not rational pleasure maximizers in the empirical world. In the empirical world, people do all kinds of stuff. Some of it pursues pleasure, but other examples of it involve slamming a door on your thumb. Now that passage there, that was where I had to put the book down. Like, I don't want to know any more about this. Problem is that people really are like that.
So she went from self-hatred to wanting to oppress the poor, to wanting wealth, to wanting to kill everyone, to wanting to hurt herself. And the worst part is that I understood every step, and it made sense.
He shines a light on those darkest corners of the human psyche. I'm not sure that I want this information, but once you start reading the book, you sort of committed.
And Catherine, who loved so much, and yet it was all out of fear, and it was all self-loathing that pushed her to do it. She seems, other than Alyosha, like the most Christian character, but in fact, she's the betrayer.
Yeah. The spiritual and psychological complexity of this novel is really amazing. I don't think there's anything in the Western tradition, in any tradition that'll touch it. In other words, I think this is as much as you can hope for out of a novel. It's an astonishing tour de force, and he's got an opinion on everything. Mm-hmm. He doesn't care for modern psychology, it turns out. Remember the psychologists that came in to testify as to what was really going on here could not have been any more wrong than they were.
Yeah.
And everyone goes, wow,
sounds so good.
It does sound so good. It's just that there's not a grain of truth in it. That's the problem.
Yeah.
All right, yeah.
Could we interpret the peasants sentencing Dmitri as a reaction against the defense attorney saying even if he had killed his father, it was legitimate? That the judgment is sort of that modern psychology, which legitimates evil, needs to be condemned.
Well, the good common sense of the peasants is something that Dostoevsky has in common with Tolstoy, all right? Because they're ignorant and illiterate and deeply Christian, but don't have any of the complexities that bedevil us. They give us pretty accurate judgments of right and wrong. And the deal is that if we have reason to believe that you killed your father, no amount of psychobabble is going to get you off the hook. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're not putting up with that. There's much to be said for that, because what we get is genuinely psychobabble is not a grain of truth in any of it towards the end of this. All right. Okay. Tell me about Big Daddy. What's the elder Karamazov like? Yeah.
I mean, pardon my French, he's a grade A asshole. The guy does his best to abandon his kids. He's unsuccessful even in that.
Yeah.
The only thing he's good at is making, he's a landlord, a rent seeker. He makes a modest amount of money and eventually becomes quite wealthy, but he's an almost entirely selfish character, who is concerned almost entirely with his own pleasure seeking and gratification. So he's probably the most pleasure-seeking creature in the whole novel, because he's just going after whoring and drinking, and just that's what he spends his life in. That.
Even worse, he wants to make everyone around him miserable, actively.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's not even just passively rejecting his own children. All right, he actively wants to do stuff that's bad for them, like, for example, spending their inheritance on liquor. All right. Or becoming a rival for Grushenka with Dmitri. That's awkward.
Yeah, do you think that's out of actual love for her, or the fact that he just wants to ruin it with
He doesn't love anybody.
Yeah.
In Russian, anybody know what Grushenka means? I should have looked it up. It's the diminutive form of the word for pear. Like in stealing pears, you've seen this. Oh, yes. Yes, it is.
What was the word for pear?
Grushenka?
Yeah.
That's her name.
Yeah.
It's little pear. It's the diminutive form of pear. So Big Daddy and Dmitri are fighting over who gets the pear.
But then Dmitri has a conversion moment.
It will happen occasionally, with and without the pears. All right. Yeah, there we go. The words matter. I mean,
Instead of Tolelege, we have a dream.
There we go. And we're not even clear that Tolelege wasn't a dream, so could work that way too. Dimitri's name is taken from Demeter. It's the masculinization of Demeter. She's the god of the earth, or goddess of the earth. Why? Because he's a real bronze guy. He's Mr. Bronze. He's a party animal. Likes liquor, women. In other words, he's got the same weaknesses as his father. Except that he's not a monster. He's actually reclaimable. He, like all the brothers, will have some kind of spiritual transformation as we get towards the end. But it's an open-ended transformation. We don't know how it's going to go. Freud thought that this was the greatest novel ever written. I think he's probably right. Nietzsche, from whom it's hard to get any kind of compliment, said Dostoevsky is the only person that has anything to teach me about psychology. That's actually pretty amazing, given that we're talking about Nietzsche here. I mean, people that disagree with him vehemently can't help but admit the power of his insights and the way the prose moves you. All right. So, Dmitri needs money. He's just come of age, and he wants to get his inheritance from his dad. His dad laughs at him, says there was no inheritance. There is no inheritance. So we have the makings of a fascinating family drama here. And it's so true to life. And it's so realistic in so many ways. I mean, there are some exaggerations of the real, but still it has a very powerful realism to it. It manages to bring in something that's alien to realism, which is a kind of overpowering spirituality. But in terms of the way this gets written, it sort of looks like Flaubert, if you know what 19th century French realism was, right? About the same time, all right? So we're merging two things here. One, a very realistic depiction of the world. I mean, in other words, there are no unicorns here. That God doesn't come down and, save anybody. On the other hand, the spiritual dimension of it outweighs all the other dimensions. So it's a very strange kind of combination. Dmitri is Mr. Bronze, and he's a party animal. He's about to engage in an Oedipal conflict with his father. This is why Freud liked it so much. He said, this is the universal family drama. Every young man desires, whether he acknowledges it or not, to kill his father and have sex with his mother. That's why we still read Oedipus, because this is a permanent structure in the development of masculinity in our species. Now, this may be entire mumbo jumbo. I am far from convinced that everyone is Oedipal. On the other hand, that some people are, that seems pretty unquestionable. And that some people are not aware of such feelings, yeah, I think that's probably true too. All right, so there's something to be gotten there. Now, the big theme is announced early on in the novel. Father, why should I love you? And
well, that's not just the Elder King.
Yeah, that's right. That's funny you should mention that. Yes, indeed. I was coming to that. That's admirable. Father, why should I love you? Who's going to present this? Who's going to tell us why we should love Father?
Okay, well, I'll get to that at the end, because
Right.
that's the very end in the trial scene. You hear the defense lawyer go into a whole speech about that, which is one of my points in here.
Mm-hmm.
But so, I mean, clearly there's so much in this book. I'm just going to go over
Yep.
a few of the themes that I thought were pretty prominent. I always got my trusty note card. Whenever I find something good, I write it down. So I'm going to go over those.
Good for you.
But so in the very beginning, I think politics is a side topic in this book, but you hear it come up a good bit, especially with socialism in the beginning. They're talking about, I think they're in the Elders Monastery, and Ivan, the intellectual, is always bringing up stuff like that on this level. I think you guys particularly are going to like this quote, because we're actually talking about this with Coleman right now, but this is such a great quote. He says, or like in the very beginning of the book, in speaking about Yasha's realization about the existence of God and immortality of the soul, he says, Dostoevsky says, by precisely the same lights, had he decided that God and immortality did not exist, he would have immediately become an atheist and a socialist, for socialism is not only a problem of labor or the so-called fourth estate, but is in the first instance a problem of atheism. On the contemporary embodiment of the atheism, the problem of the Tower of Babel, constructed expressly without God, not for the attainment of heaven from earth, but for the abasement of heaven to earth. So
Which chapter is that?
It's, let me see, the Elders, right in the beginning of the Elders.
Thank you.
And we're talking exactly about this, how if he's, the best part about it, he says socialism is the atheistic question. It's this desire to build a heaven on earth, because without God,
Excellent. That's actually a brilliant point. Here's the deal. People that are pursuing utopian politics are in fact pursuing heaven. The only difference between people pursuing heaven and people pursuing utopia is the vocabulary of their theology. So utopian left-wing movements are all disguised Christianity.
just falling short.
Yep. Good boy.
So like
Keep
the
going.
Tower of Babel, so exactly that's what they try to do. That's what we're talking about right now in Coleman's class, is their desire to build, socialism is a desire to build this tower that will surpass the flood, will outlast the flood. And they think that they can build that here, but clearly socialism in and of itself is an evil and is never, doesn't really work. And so he highlights that point a lot, and obviously Christianity would go against that. So another point, I thought was really cool. So I looked a little bit into his background before I started reading, and his one of his earlier books, The Idiot, it describes, the book's essentially about how he had a near-death experience. He was called before a firing squad because he was hanging around some controversial thinkers of his time, and they were sentenced to death. And right before he was about to be shot, the guards came out and gave an order for them to not be killed and sent to a prison far away. And in Dostoevsky's book, The Idiot, he talks about, I didn't get to read the full thing, but I did a little overview of it, how right before that moment of death, he looked up and saw the beauty of life, saw the flowers, the trees, the sun shining on a cathedral, and he just was like, wow. And he just had a moment of if everyone lived their life like this all the time, it would be beautiful, and they would be seen as an idiot, hence the title of his book, The Idiot. And he goes through that whole book talking about how everyone would see this man as an idiot because he sees life as so beautiful. So throughout Brothers Karamazov, which was written after, that theme kept appearing in my mind, and I kept seeing instances where he intentionally puts in people realizing the beauty of life at certain points. And especially with Dmitri, there's one point early on page 118, here's a quote. He says, let us render praise unto nature. Look at all the sun, the heavens so cloudless, the leaves all green. It's still high summer, 4 PM, and what silence. Where are you off to? And then there's just a whole paragraph of him just realizing the beauty of life. And then contrast that towards the end of the book. You see him in the prison or in the courtroom, and he realizes he could be close to death, and he realizes the beauty of life, and he's willing to repent, and he sees the trial and all this stuff. He's like, wow, I'm a terrible man. I need to change. And I feel like that was similar to Dostoevsky at the firing squad. He's like, wow, life's beautiful. And then after he changed and started writing novels and everything. So
that's a really good point. Dostoevsky, you need to know a little about. He's got organic brain problems. He is believed to have had what's called Geschwind's syndrome. This you will find interesting, particularly those of you who are interested in questions of philosophy of psychology. People that have Geschwind syndrome are epileptics. They're a subset of epileptics. They can't help but write all the time. For some reason they have what's graphololia or something. In other words, they compulsively write. Now here's the kicker. For reasons that are not clear, people that have Geschwind syndrome, this particular kind of epilepsy, not only do they write all the time, but for reasons that are not clear to doctors of neurology, they become hyper-religious. In other words, they don't write things about gardening or astronomy. They write books about religion. Yeah, that's what seems clear about this to me. They could be writing about football, they're not. In other words, people that have this particular syndrome, they write, and they're 90% of their consciousness appears to be devoted to religion. That's a trip. I mean, roll that around in your mind for a while. So, have a look at Geschwind syndrome. It's believed that Dostoevsky had this, and there are other people that have it and have the same habits of mind. Dostoevsky is a seriously sick pup. He was a compulsive gambler that lost all his money regularly, despite the fact that he was married. So he wrote his first book, called The Gambler, was written to pay off gambling debts. Right? It's about obsessive compulsive. Look, there are people who go to the Indian casino who know perfectly well that they're going to lose. They don't build large casinos by losing. Right? So when you go there, you know that they're going there to lose your money. All right? Everybody that does it knows that. And they keep coming back. Some of them lose the rent. Some of them lose dinner. Those kind of compulsions are the kind of thing that Dostoevsky focuses on, he specializes on. And these are the irrational drives that we have that we cannot control and hardly understand. So his first novel was The Gambler, and that was about somebody that has what we would nowadays call a gambling addiction. But back then we hadn't medicalized it. It was a spiritual problem back then. To tell you the truth, it's a spiritual problem right now, too. These are people that like the idea of self-destruction. They just do it in slow motion. All right. If you know the odds are against you, every time you spin the wheel, you're looking for that double zero. All right. Now, Dostoevsky was seriously bent by this near execution. Turns out the Tsar has a real great sense of humor. The other people involved, he was actually, when a student, involved in a plot to get rid of the Tsar and create a socialist, westernized government. The Tsar's secret police found out. They shot the main conspirators.
So it's a socialist?
Socialist, yeah.
Of course.
And then he writes so adamantly against socialism.
That's right,
later
exactly.
On. Wow.
Socialism is one of those Western ideas, right, which he thinks are mostly corrupt or completely corrupt. The Tsar doesn't want to kill everybody involved, but doesn't tell them because he wants to teach them a lesson. So he actually puts them out in front of a wall with a firing squad in front of it, and they're actually aiming at these guys. And I'm told that there's nothing like looking down the barrel of a gun to focus your attention. And that the opening, which is actually rather small, appears to be very, very large because your mortality is coming out of it. And at that point, it had been arranged that some messenger would ride in on horseback, tell them to stop, just as they're about to shoot Dostoevsky. Now, this completely wigs the guy out. He's just never the same after this. And that's understandable, actually. Here we got a guy with organic brain problems who's an obsessive-compulsive gambler who's just encountered his own morality, and instead of being killed, gets sent to Siberia for a few years so he can think about it, which he does. There's not a lot of libraries where he's going. I mean, all he has to do is think about his soul and how the fact that he nearly died and all that kind of jazz. This is when he moves from being a westernizer to being a Slavophile.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh. Yeah. Is there more?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, when you're saying that, I was thinking he must have some type of neurosis to write 800 something pages, and he probably feels like he couldn't finish exactly what he wanted to, and he just kept going. It also reminded me of Don Quixote, whereas I think the pages are definitely more necessary. But
Don Quixote desperately needs an edit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like Moby Dick. If we're half as long, it'd be twice as good.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of stuff you can get rid of there. Mm-hmm. Here, I think not so much. I mean, we have lots of plots and subplots, with the children and the boys and Captain Snevrigan, or what his name is, at the end with the child that dies. Something you should think about: the year before he wrote this, Dostoevsky's 3-year-old son died. Mm-hmm. Boy's name was Alyosha.
Oh, wow. Didn't know that.
He died at the age of 3 as a result of epilepsy, which he inherited from his father.
Is it I'm guessing that has to do with the story of Oyasha as well.
That's right.
Wow.
That's who it is. He's Captain Sniverogan.
Wow. Wow.
Okay? So he's writing this in the deepest kind of grief. And he's asking himself, in both of your senses, Father, why should I love you? He's doing that on behalf of his son, who's now dead, Alyosha. Dad, you gave me this lethal epilepsy and all. Why should I love you? And Dostoevsky is not actually all that sure of what a good answer would be. And this is a question that gets asked by everybody. One of the things that's most shattering about this book is the question that the Freudian question that he asks. Who has not wished for the death of his father? Freud says, look, no one will own up to that. But everybody has. The prior generation is an impediment. And your feelings are, of course, properly constrained by civilization, so you don't kill your father. But that impulse, that psychic dynamism, yeah, that's there. So, who has not wished for the death of his father? Well, it turns out not these sons. All right. Dmitri has wished the death of his father because of his bronze proclivities. Daddy's got Grushenka and he wants her. Ivan has wished the death of his father because Ivan is loveless. And Ivan doesn't care whether the old man lives or dies. Matter of indifference to him. And even Alyosha, in his weaker moments, seeing the horror that his father is. When he's tempted by atheism, he's also tempted to find a way of living with the death of his father. His mortality is not a problem. At least in his weaker moments, not all the time. You perhaps have noticed that these three boys are the three parts of Plato's soul. They're all fragmentary people looking for integration. It's a little bit like the Wizard of Oz. We've got these three people that are missing something, and they're on a journey to get it. Dmitri wants to get some control over his appetites, which he does when he has his conversion. Ivan wants to learn how to love, which is something he thought he could dispense with because of his Greek rationality. Towards the end, it looks like he's going to marry Katerina Ivanova. And Alyosha, he tells the boys that were friends of the dead Ilusha, always remain faithful to God, to religion, and to each other. Mm-hmm. They throw up their caps and say huzzah for Dostoevsky, for Karamazov. Yeah.
Speak like in a platonic sense. There was one point where I noticed, where is it? Towards, let me see, around 460. The point where he's running back to Pyotr Ilyich after he goes to Fyodor Pavlovich's house, and after he beats Grigori, and he's all bloody and everything, and he goes to Fyodor Pavlovich and he says, "Give me my pistol back," and he asks him for it back. And in that moment, I was thinking that in the Republic of Kephalus' definition of justice, of giving back to people what they're owed.
Very good.
And should you give back the gun? Should you give back the gun in that sense? Yes, that would be justice to Kephalus, but to Dostoevsky or to Plato, no, you shouldn't be giving him the pistol back when he's bloody.
Reading. Excellent reading.
in that sense. So I was like, oh, I thought that was pretty cool.
I do, yeah. I mean, what I like best about this is that you're able to do excellent readings. I really like that.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think you're right on the money there.
Yeah. There was one more from Fear and Trembling as well, because I did this presentation. There was one line that stuck out. He says, Ivan was speaking, he says, "There you have it." But Ivan shouted, "You ought to realize, novice, that the preposterous things are all too necessary upon earth. The world rests upon preposterous things, and it's possible that without them, absolutely nothing would ever come into existence. We know that which we know," in the sense of, on the strength of the absurd, that sometimes that the religious isn't always something that makes sense, but it's the right thing to do. It's the answer, and Ivan realizing that. I don't know if he would have read.
Oh, he wouldn't have read it. I mean,
Okay.
nobody was reading it for a while.
Okay.
But although he wouldn't have read it, the ideas are actually very similar. You're right.
Okay.
I mean, they're both radical Christians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? So yeah, your point is very well taken there. Rationality is not enough. I mean, that's been the Christian answer since the time of Augustine. There's much to be said for that. But to be fair to both sides, when you're trying to be more than reasonable, the danger is that you end up less than reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And since most people that claim to be more than reasonable are disagreeing with one another, the sure thing is that they can't all be right. As a matter of fact, there's a whole collection of them that can't possibly be right. So there's real danger here. When you go beyond reason, okay, how do you know you're not going beneath it? What allows you to be certain of that? Very tricky. Very tricky. What can you tell me? I mean, since we're dealing with the three parts of the soul and the boys and how they're, Alyosha's on top because the spirited has been turned into the spiritual, and he's the acme of what we might aspire to be. Right? He's the Christ figure. There's no Dostoevsky novel that doesn't have a Christ figure. In The Idiot, it's the idiot himself. All right? But Alyosha is our Christ figure, and everybody likes him, but nobody knows why. All right, he's nice to everybody, and everybody likes him.
He always tells the truth.
He always does tell the truth, and people don't get offended by it. I mean, there's something extraordinary about it. He's got this sort of glow, all right, that doesn't interfere with the realism of the novel. All right? But there's somebody we've left out. What can you tell me about Smerdyakov?
Judas.
Judas, okay. Partially. But also not Judas in the sense that rather than betray his teacher, he's actually carrying out his teacher's orders. Yeah?
I was just thinking of the part where he killed himself, and I guess.
Ah, yes, that's exactly it. And then later on, the prosecuting attorney proves that no one could possibly do that without leaving a note exonerating your brother. It's a good thing that's the case. Because that's psychologically impossible, and prosecutors are aware of what's psychologically possible and not. That's an incredibly damning indictment about our puny rationality. I mean, he makes a good speech, it sounds good, and the problem is it's entirely sophistical and there's not any truth in it at all.
You almost wish it was true.
Yeah, right, because the world was much more predictable.
Yeah.
One of the funny things, I mean, again, Dostoevsky opens this up to us, but psychopathology is actually surprisingly prosaic. In other words, you must have noticed that everybody seems sane until you get to know them, right? And you go, well, that's your. Everybody's got a couple of those loose ends, and you don't notice people until they start to talk to you, and you can find out, well, that's an unusual belief. And nearly everybody has some beliefs that are unusual or idiosyncratic. The ones that don't are actually in the worst shape. But that's the ones that want to be limited by rationality, haven't thought the problem through. Back to Smerdyakov, though. Tell me about it.
He's an illegitimate son.
Okay, he's a bastard from stinking Lizaveta, the mentally handicapped kind of edge of society.
He also has epilepsy.
Funny you should mention that, yeah. That is the mark of some kind of congenital problem, all right? And the problem is a sickness unto death. It is not so much a physical problem as a physical representation of a spiritual problem. His name is Smerdyakov. Remember that the Russian high culture is saturated in French high culture. That's their standard. The reason he's called Smerdyakov is because of the connection to the French merde, which means shit. M-E-R-D-E is the French word for shit. That's why he's Smerdyakov.
It sounds like shit.
Everybody reading it would have understood that. Huh?
I could have sworn that the Elder K gave me this name.
It wouldn't surprise me.
Who?
It would not.
Elder Karamazov name.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that struck me about Elizabeth's mother is that she also has like a little bit of the same glow that Aloysia has.
Yeah.
Where she's also sort of cared for by everyone, even if she's not liked in the way he is.
Mhm.
There's that certain like respect that they give. Like she has that. Like maybe what Andrew's talking about. Like she also walks around randomly like the idiots, maybe
Mhm.
irrational from the outside, but maybe so the people are kind to her. They're not always cruel.
That's right. Her husband, of course,
Right.
is a monster.
Right.
All right. So we get a related set of questions here. Father, why should I love you? All right. Who has not wished for the death of his father? I'm getting all Freudian and psychological with the Oedipus complex there. What's the answer? Why should I love you? And who has not wished for the death of his father? These are not just rhetorical questions. You may think they are, but they're not. Yeah.
In terms of Alyosha being, in the beginning I was like, oh, Alyosha is Christ. But then I started to realize, well, maybe not. He's just a Christ-like figure.
Right.
And I mean, there's plenty of examples like how Grushenka is a prostitute and he's coming to heal her, like Christ as well.
She's trying to tempt him.
Right.
And instead, he brings her back from sin and despondency.
Mm-hmm. And like just how all the women love him, the youth, the elders. But then I started to think, well, it doesn't make sense because of his relationship with Lisa. And then I started to think in another way of Zosima as like a Christ-like figure, and then Alyosha being his best apostle, like Peter or something. So I couldn't quite figure out. I was toying with all the ideas. Is he Christ? Is he Christ-like figure? Is he a best apostle? Like I couldn't figure out what the.
Maybe Christ is like the limit of an asymptote. He is moving in the direction of Christ-likeness, but no one, although we would all like to move in that direction, none of us ever get in there. Mm-hmm. Right? So he's in the process of shedding his sins, redeeming himself by taking his love from the monastery to the world. All right?
Why is that? Why does he have to leave the monastery?
Yeah.
Because he is not suited, or rather, because the world is calling him.
Mm-hmm.
Father Zosima can hear the call that he cannot. And he knows that this is a fated, fractured family, which is why he does that very strange thing of bowing down and kissing Dimitri's feet. Remember that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very enigmatic thing to do, and there's been lots and lots written about that. I think it has to do with the fact that he sees that the essence of sin is alive and well inside this family. In other words, the earliest, most primitive sins, the sins of Cain and Abel, all right, the sins of not parricide, but ill treatment of one's elders. That's what happens with the curse of Noah to Ham. All right. So this is a cursed family. And Zosima is bowing down because I think he's expressing as best he can his utter sympathy with these lost people.
What's his relationship with Lisa? What is that? I couldn't really make out why that was in there.
Because no matter how depraved and messed up you are, the skeleton key that unlocks all psychological locks is Alyosha, right? Because Alyosha is as close as we come to the embodiment of love. All right, so he is the spirit of the law. So everybody likes him, no matter how messed up they are. Even totally twisted people like Lisa, or Grushenka, or Katrina Ivanova, all of whom were, both of those were supposed to be fallen women. He meets them and says they're just actually regular people. They really are sinners like any of us, and they don't deserve our condemnation. You can't imagine Ivan responding like that. All right? Yeah.
One of the most moving scenes to me was when Zosima blesses Ivan. He says, either you are a blessed man or you are an utterly miserable man, knowing as you do that without God all is permissible. Either you are completely happy in your love for God, or you've rejected God and are miserable until you find the truth.
That's a wonderful way of putting it, exactly right. Father Zosima can see the trials that come with being excessively rational. Right? Augustine says, our hearts are restless until it rests in thee. It's harder to rest inside the theorem of Pythagoras. Right? Although the people, Plato tried. Right?
It's also noticeable that towards the end of the book, Alyosha says essentially the same thing to young Kolya.
Yes, yes.
So he's become a Zosima.
That's exactly right. What we're doing here is watching the development of these minds. These are all fragmentary people looking for wholeness. Remember Aristophanes' speech in the Symposium? It's actually surprisingly similar to that. Each one of these boys is a part of that tripartite soul looking for the other parts. And in order to get to those parts, they have to suffer, because that is purifying. That's what happens with Ivan, with his encounter with the devil. Now, it's represented as being a dream, possibly. But it may also have been the devil. I mean, no, that would be really diabolical, right? To actually show up in somebody's room and completely mess people up. Because then you're going to go out and say, I really talk to the devil, and people are going to think you're crazy, but of course you have.
Which is exactly what he wanted.
Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? You know?
I really thought, I was surprised. I was waiting for the whole time of the evidence of Ivan talking about how Smerdyakov talked to him in the trial, but then he never got the chance to say that. And
that's right.
I didn't understand why.
He wanted to give testimony, but he's crazy.
Yeah.
So he's run into the room and says, I'm guilty, not Dmitri. I'm guilty because Smerdyakov told me I was guilty, and I'm guilty because the devil reinforced that with me last night. I talked to the devil, and I'd like to turn myself in. Now, he gets led out of the courtroom in a restraint, right? Because you're visibly crazy. All right. Of course, he's telling them, he's the only guy telling the truth in the whole place. Everybody else is making stuff up, and that they're willing to live with. Right. That's so messed up. I'm sorry. I mean, Dostoevsky's really kind of laying it on pretty thick here. I mean, I like it. I really enjoy it, but it's kind of a guilty pleasure. You could go a little easier on it. All right. Now, Smerdyakov likes talking philosophy with Ivan. But unlike Ivan, he doesn't live his life in his mind. Smerdyakov is capable of action as well, whereas Ivan is not.
So he's very similar to the main character in Crime and Punishment.
Yes.
I forget his name.
Raskolnikov.
Right, the superior name.
Yeah. And that's lifted right from Nietzsche. I mean, it's not stolen, but they're not separate. Is it true that if God doesn't exist, everything is permitted?
Nietzsche thought so.
Yeah, I did. It's true. So did Gorgias. So did Thrasymachus. Okay. So did Machiavelli. Callicles, yep. At the end of the Gorgias. Good for you. I'm glad to see you've read that. That speaks well for you. Callicles' last speech is actually the best pre-Nietzschean book that you're ever going to read. Okay, is everything permitted if God doesn't exist? Is there no moral order to the world? The Greeks seem to think so, or maybe Aristotle thinks so. He thinks virtue is a mean between two vices. He doesn't mention God.
It's difficult to walk between different extreme positions, but the best I can get at is that we intuit morality before we intuit God, but then once we intuit God, we recognize that morality depends on Him.
Mm-hmm.
So if we then deny God, we implicitly deny morality, whether or not the new atheists are smart enough to realize it.
Okay, so if we deny God, you tell me that we deny ethics. How does that work?
God is the good in Plato, as Plato taught us. So
But you don't want to go there, do you?
well, I kind of do.
Okay, I mean, the good isn't a person.
Our first instincts of God are impersonal. It takes a lot of philosophical work to eventually recognize that the impersonal force we first encounter actually is a person.
That's interesting. Okay, so if God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted. Okay, so you're willing to affirm that. Any of you guys like the natural world? Say Hume's account of ethics, who just go, well, look. People mostly don't torture their children because they mostly think it's bad, and they're mostly right. What does God have to do with this? I mean, if I hadn't given you Jesus and Christianity and religion, would any of you like torturing children? Okay. Do you notice a pattern there? That quite a few people feel that way. Well, so why is it permitted to torture children if you don't have God around?
Because God is the ground of all our natures, and so if the ground is removed, if the anchor around which we have all been sailing is removed, then all of a sudden our natures are meaningless, and we can refashion them however we so please.
Okay. The ground and anchors.
Analogies.
Yeah. Metaphors.
Both problematic.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Well, I'm just borrowing from Nietzsche, so.
No, well, okay, well, that's even,
That's even
that
worse.
fits you even stranger, I must say, but I'm impressed. It's kind of quite versatile. Yeah.
Instead of purely from a different perspective,
Yeah.
instead of God being the ground of our nature and the ground of our morality, I would say that the reason torturing children is impermissible is because God is the final judge, and once we remove that final judgment, everything would become permissible because it doesn't matter anymore.
Okay. So, before, say, the advent of Christianity, torturing children was permissible?
It was permissible, but if you argue there's like this abstract concept we find of natural law that runs through everything, which is more what I would subscribe to in this case, if we are arguing from an atheistic point of view for morality.
Okay, that's plausible. I'm not sure it's atheistic, though. Natural law is always covert theology. You can't have it without God.
Right, but if we're denying God.
Okay, if you're denying it, then you're also going to deny natural law. That is just going to be atoms in the void.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to have a human
So-
or an Epicurean ethics.
That's right.
So what about a more biological approach to this? Like that torturing children is bad because it hurts the reproduction of the species. And
Okay.
so there's, and I want to say that like people, not Singer, but other, like Harris would say, argue this.
Right, so the problem with that is that slavery is very beneficial for the continuance of the species.
Right. But I'm just saying that like that it's not a perfect form of morality, but it's a if you do deny God, you can still recognize that there's some rules that you should follow because
It's the kind of thing the Romans or the Mongols would have understood.
Yeah.
I mean, there's plenty of examples.
Don't.
I'll get you in a second.
Okay.
The problem isn't so much that there are awful things like slavery that might be beneficial to the reproduction of our species, but the other question is the fact that biologically we strive to, or at least for most people do, strive to keep their offspring alive. How does the fact that people do that prove that people ought to do that? You know, you're deriving an ought from an is, and there's no set of things that people do that's evolution, that's advantageous or disadvantageous in an evolutionary sense. that you could possibly get any author.
This is somewhere where my thinking has gone, and this I think is actually a powerful argument against, I guess, some degree of immoralism, right? Because the fundamental problem, even biologically, would say Nazism is that there aren't any Nazis anymore. They did a damn good run at taking over the world and becoming the system, but clearly they could not, because it was too great a threat to other systems. So even biologically, things like murder can't persist. So if your goal, in like a Machiavellian sense, is power, persistence, sticking around to the next generation, then having a set of moral laws or a moral code is advantageous, and you just can't deny that historically.
That's a good point for Machiavelli. The problem is that you can't deny the advantage of a moral code except when it is useful, in which case you can.
So the Machiavellian, just as the Nietzschean or the Callicles or the Thrasymachus.
He's an anti-Kantian. Kant says you mustn't murder people because would you want to be murdered? And Machiavelli says, no, I don't want to be murdered. And I'm certainly going to murder people more effectively then. Because all the more effectively because I don't want to be murdered. I'm dealing with a bunch of murderous, treacherous people, and nice guys finish last. And so, although I can't universalize the maxim, I very much do intend to murder people.
As dear me, the second main character in the Republic starts with a G. Glaucon says the ideal evil man appears to be good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. All right, so the question of whether God's non-existence means everything is permitted, some people draw that inference. Others would say, well, you might derive your ethics from nature. I think that, for example, that's what Aristotle believes he's doing. He's looking at human nature, he's looking at human life and human society, and then he's saying these things are advantageous for the flourishing of human beings. And I think what he's doing is talking about this in the same way that you might talk about the kind of soil and sunlight and rain that's advantageous for roses, because he's a biologist. And it's a biological fact that roses are hard to grow on the South Pole because it's too cold, but there are other environments which are better for them. And so in that sense, if what you mean by ethics is flourishing within the natural world, which is not a far-fetched account of what a naturalistic ethics would sound like, well then there are some kinds of soil and some kinds of fertilizer that are good for roses and some that aren't. Similar thing would be true of people. If you're one of those monsters that, throws a kid in the closet and doesn't raise him and, comes out at 10 and he's, essentially not a human being in the sense of the development of consciousness, well, that's one way in which human beings might develop, but it's not the most advantageous. In fact, in other words, Aristotle would say, look, it's an objective fact that some conditions are good for roses and some for bad. And it's an objective fact that some conditions are good for human flourishing and some aren't. You lock the kid in the closet, that's not good for him.
Or for you.
Right, and so there's no argument to make here. He thinks it's a matter of fact. Now he's ignoring the is-ought distinction. He's saying, no, Hume, you're wrong. If what you mean by ought is the things that make the X flourish, well, there are some conditions that do that and some don't. Fish, on the whole, if you want to continue having them be fish-like, should be in the water. Being on land is not good for them, it turns out. And this is not controversial. It's not just, well, that's your subjective opinion. No, I mean, fish are very unhappy on deck, and they really want to be in the water because that's where they belong. And that's where they flourish best. And there really isn't all that much argument to have about it. In other words, that's not a pure opinion. That's not purely subjective. Okay, if it should work for fish and roses, why doesn't it work for people? In other words, I'm calling into question this business of, does it depend on God? There are cultures that don't have monotheism, and yet they seem to develop ideas about right and wrong and about good and evil which restrict their conduct. All right? Incest, for example, is prohibited pretty much everywhere and doesn't have anything to do with Yahweh or the Bible. Okay, so is it true that without God all things are permitted? It's more controversial than it immediately suggests. All right. If we need not just God, but the right God, the real God, that means that the vast majority of our species have no ethics, and I think it has an empirical fact. It would have been impossible to put together the Roman Empire or the Muslim, juggernaut, unless they had some idea of ethics, because as Plato points out, if they're unjust amongst themselves, they're not going to get anything done. All right? So it may be a defective understanding of right and wrong. It may be an incomplete understanding of right and wrong. Yet I'm not completely sure that Dostoevsky is right here. He might be. What do you think?
I mean, haven't societies, even like predating Christianity, they've always had gods. So, in a sense, they would always be basing it. Well, if I do this wrong action, this God's gonna condemn me if I do this.
That doesn't work though because of Confucius and Buddha.
Why so?
Confucius is agnostic about God at best. The Buddha is straight up atheistic. But they're some of the most moral individuals who ever lived.
Okay.
Which is deeply disconcerting.
So,
It is.
So how could you answer that they know to do the good versus?
The way that I would articulate it is that it takes an enormous amount of effort and an enormous amount of time. We've all read the Quran. It's incredibly hard to come to the conception of the immaterial, invisible God who is the source of morality. Before you come to that conception, we have an idea of morality. Not just an idea, but a very strong idea, present in many cultures. Eventually, if you follow that all the way out, you come to the ineffable God. If you then deny the ineffable God, it's like all the things that were built on it just all of a sudden crumble. But if you don't have full conception of God and you deny him, then you don't see the effects. This is what's wrong with the new atheists. They don't understand what they're denying. Nietzsche understood what he was denying, and that's why he's Nietzsche.
That's a good point. I don't know if you're familiar with the kind of new atheists, but they get on my nerves too. I share frustration with this. They're kind of middle-browed, chest-thumping, science-worshipping guys. And they're not stupid, but they just... they like simplicity more than is good for them, right? These are guys that very much value intellectual tidiness, and the idea of loose strings just really sets them off. There are some people like that can't. No, you ever see somebody that has to have a perfectly clean house or a perfectly clean dorm room? Less usual, admittedly, but it does in fact happen. Okay, well, there are certain people who feel that way about their thinking rather than their room. Right? They like tidiness. They don't want any loose ends. And that's the main attraction of these kind of reductive systems. Right? It's clean, doesn't leave anything left over. It's all matter all the way down. I sympathize with their desire for simplicity and clarity. I'm not sure they're going the right direction here, but these are not frivolous ideas. All right? Yeah?
Well, I don't know if you want
to... Go ahead.
Okay. I would sort of contest your idea that natural law always results in a belief in a God.
No. I tell what I think is that it's a belief in God that generates natural law.
But I think it's possible to come to an understanding, even if you don't call it natural law, I think it's possible to come to an understanding of something like natural law without a belief in God.
It may be the case. I think that Aristotle's idea of the flourishing of roses would be something like that.
Mm-hmm. That seems to me like just another appeal to power or to biology, right? Because what's the problem if you don't give roses enough water? They die and they don't stick around, and so you don't have any roses that flourish without water. That just is more is.
That's true.
So you might be able to make that objection to Aristotle himself. The later Aristotelian tradition recognizes that all natures come from God, and as such, they have a moral imperative built into them.
Right.
That you act in accordance with the nature that has been given you. This is what we're talking about in Coleman's class.
Sure.
So whether or not Aristotle, there's a strong argument to be made that Aristotle already grasped this, because for him, God is the goal of everything. So all human goals would be subsumed to God as final goal. Regardless, the Aristotelian tradition is a little stronger on this than the Hume is on distinction.
Well, right, but there's two problems there. One is that when you acknowledge that with the later Aristotelians, that they realize it's God or nothing, or rather, it may be better to say that it's God or biology at work, which is just what persists, what sticks around. She was saying, yeah.
So what biology is just more is.
Well, right, and the other thing is biology actually doesn't point you in any way towards goal-based behavior in the true sense.
So that's, you and I may disagree about this.
You're entitled to.
But the biology is unintelligible without goal-based behavior. What is a stomach?
The stomach is where food becomes digested, and stomachs which don't digest food don't have reproducing macroorganisms, and so they've ceased to be.
Before you even get the definition, in order to distinguish the stomach from the rest of the body, you have to distinguish what the stomach is for. The stomach is for...
There's a very tricky verbal thing going on there, but determining between a thing's purpose and what function it is carrying out is not present in biology. Form equals function,
So,
right?
but function is always goal-based. A function is for the sake of something.
Why is that the case?
Try to explain any aspect of the human body to me without implicitly telling
Okay,
me
but
what the thing is
that's
for.
linguistic.
It's not.
That tells you about
No,
it.
it's not linguistic, because it's not a matter of language, but it's a matter of the understanding of reality.
Let's talk about yeast, just because this is fresh in my mind. We were doing this last year. Yeast, there's a particular, I guess it's a protein that's toxic to yeast. When it imports a certain chemical, when you introduce this protein, the yeast dies. Okay, and then the only yeast that are left are the ones that don't import that protein. Where did that protein become for killing yeast? It just seems that it kills yeast and then it doesn't kill other yeast.
So the short answer is take metaphysics. The long answer, the medium answer that I can give right now is that the protein does not intend the death of the yeast. The yeast does not intend to die by result of the protein. But there is a sense in which the properties of the molecule are ordered to killing yeast insofar as when these molecules and yeast interact, always or for the most part, the death of the yeast ensues. But that's not intentional. It's not intended. It's simply the recognition of repeatable instances of a form leading to a function.
Right. That's why I think that biology cannot take you to purpose. You have to take a
biology in
step.
biology in the modern sense cannot take you to moral purpose, but a complete study of the human being cannot ignore that we are directed towards practical action.
Okay, but consider you have two populations of human being. One that would be directed towards practical action, like harvesting food, and one that's not interested in food. The only thing that biology
Show me a
tells
human being that's not interested in food.
Well, exactly. The thing is, the only thing biology tells you is that were there such human beings, they died, they aren't around anymore.
So
that's all that tells
but
you.
the conception of biology that you're using is foreign to the Aristotelian tradition.
Well, right, because
the anthropology is what we need to look at, not merely biology.
Can I interject something?
Please.
I think there's a distinction between something being ordered to something and being ordered in a way that it results in a certain end.
Okay.
So you said the bacteria or the protein is ordered to cause the death.
Right, maybe that's
and
not the best. Ordered in such a way that.
I think we could look at human nature the same way, that we can look and see human nature is ordered in a way that it is conducive to our goodness and the goodness of our society to take care of our children and practice justice and things like that. So even if there is no, like, God imposing a moral absolute, there is still something that we can look at and say we are ordered in a way that makes this good.
Correct. But the problem is the problem of the perfect evil man in the Republic, who recognizes that, says it's very beneficial for the hoi polloi to have morality. As Voltaire says, I'm very glad that my tailor believes in God.
The opiate of the masses.
Exactly. Opiate of the masses. Great that everyone's high. Now I'm going to go murder a couple of people on my rise to power.
Mm-hmm.
This is where God becomes a necessary postulant.
I don't understand how it's a problem to the theory, though. I understand how it's a problem to the practice.
Right. Yeah. So it doesn't change anything that you just said. You're correct. Everything that you said is correct. But the point is that intelligent people like Ivan or Smirchikov can take advantage of that to do whatever they
Sure,
want.
but intelligent people can take advantage of God and morality when we believe that that exists, too.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
If
But they will burn in hell as a result.
Okay, but the question we're asking is if morality exists without God, not whether people are going to burn in hell.
Fair?
This is great. I mean, you made such tremendous strides. Think of where you were 18 months ago. You couldn't do this. I mean, it's actually nice to watch. No, I mean, you're actually real intermediates now. I mean, you have something to connect things to, and it's nice to see. I mean, it never gets old, actually, seeing people able to do this. Now, I had a couple of questions. I had so many questions in the course of this. It was bouncing off the inside of my head. But the question I have for you is, I can see how it works for the softball examples. What do you want to do with the hard ones, like the earlobe? I mean,
Yeah, entirely fair.
what does that do?
The Aristotelian claim is that any object, any existing finite object, has some minimum level of teleological function insofar as, in certain situations, it will always, or for the most part, do what it's done in the past.
Okay.
That's like the bare minimum level of teleology. Some things have a higher level of teleological function, and some composites that have many layers of higher level teleological function also have leftover bits that don't have that higher level function. So the earlobe doesn't have a purpose that is contributive to the whole in the same way that stomach does.
Okay. A purpose that's contributive to the whole, how's that different from a purpose?
There's a purpose, so that we're dealing with analogy here, but the purpose of my fingernail in of itself is just to be hard and to continue being hard, to continue repelling things when it's bounced up against things. As a part of a whole, it's helpful in that I can scratch things and pick things up. But so there's that. The Aristotelian claim is not that every object is part of a whole, but that in itself it has properties that repeat in successive circumstances. It's very similar to what Newton is trying to describe with his laws.
Okay, so my earlobe acts in such a way as to be at the bottom of my ear rather than, say, turning into an elk. Okay.
That's
am
all.
I understanding that that its function is not to turn into an elk?
More or less, yes.
Okay. You've got me completely baffled. I have no idea. In other words,
Fair enough.
I mean, it's doing an excellent job of not turning it into an elk. I mean, I've never actually been worried that it might. If that is sufficient to attribute a telos to something, then your standards are actually,
Pretty low.
Pretty low, yeah.
No, they are.
Yeah.
Once you start attributing purposes to electrons, then your standards are pretty low.
Okay. Why should we have any standard at all, since it doesn't seem to add anything to our understanding of earlobes?
Because we can't understand efficient causality without a reference to final causality.
Why do we need to understand efficient causality?
The basic claim is that the world is intelligible.
Earlobes are perfectly intelligible even if they don't have a function.
They're intelligible if they don't have a function as a part of the human whole. but they aren't intelligible if they don't repeatedly engage in the same activity over time.
Yes, it would be very odd if they should occasionally turn into elk. But since I haven't been burdened with any such occurrence, that is something I would worry about.
Right, so the background of this is the refutation of Hume.
Oh, well, it's the denial of Hume. It's not quite the same thing as a refutation.
I think there is a refutation.
You might well be right. I don't deny that. It's not clear to me how attributing teloi to things that... Well,
I'm not saying that telos refutes Hume. I'm saying that in the process of refuting Hume, we come to the conclusion of telos.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm happy with telos when I can get it. In other words, I don't want to open the door with my eye because that would be most damaging to my eye. And I don't want to look around with my hand because my hand can't see. I'm happy with the easy ones. It's the hard examples that I don't know what to do with.
I understand.
All right.
I spent the last 2 years trying to figure it out, and I've gotten close.
Good for you. No, I mean, there's a doctoral dissertation there if you got something. It's an interesting set of problems, particularly because remember that biology has been fundamentally changed in the 19th century by Darwin. All right. What that means is that, for example, the nature of a horse is no longer a clear and distinct thing. I mean, back in the day, we could just ask Plato what the ideal horse looked like, and he would tell you. But now we have eohippus and mesohippus and all those things turning into the big hippus.
Yeah.
And at any point, well, they're all horses in a way, but early on, they're the size of rabbits.
Right. Yeah, so late scholastics got themselves into a lot of trouble by trying to attribute a clear and distinct purpose to every function of any of any body. Descartes is the most famous example.
You seem as late scholastic. There's some truth in that, actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's the last breath and the final denial of scholasticism.
I would have gone with Occam, but we're going to have to talk about that sometime. Here's the deal. Let me come away from this. I don't want to drift off into this because it's too damned easy.
It is.
It is. No, you're an admirable digression, but a digression nonetheless. All right. God does not exist. Everything is permitted. It's a question of whether ethics can be naturalistic or not. All right. Does ethics require metaphysics? Well, the one-world guys like Hume say no. What you see is what you get. The two-world guys like Kant said no. You can't get it all from it is, and you have to get it from Kantian philosophy, from the categorical imperative. All right. The Epicureans believe that you can get a naturalistic ethics. So do all the scientific reductionists, like today's new atheists.
Or Dakota, if you remember.
What? Dakota, consistent naturalism, yeah. Really, I mean, here's a handy guy to have around. You need a consistent naturalist in class so I can call on him when I need somebody to get all scientific for me. But, you know.
What about utilitarianism?
What about it?
Like how does that fit into a sort of natural,
Well,
or is that more of an economic?
No. Mill works really hard in utilitarianism. the dumbest argument of the 19th century. All right? Utility, all right, is desirable because it is desired. Now, what he's doing is the old shell game, and he doesn't even notice it. He doesn't know that he's lying, right? To call something visible means you can see it. To call something audible means you can hear it. But to call something desirable does not mean that you can desire it, because you can desire murder and rape and all kinds of evil things. So what he's doing is taking things like visible and audible, making an implicit analogy between that and desirable, and saying you can prove that pleasure is desirable by the fact that people desire it. They wouldn't be able to desire it if it weren't desirable. Well, yes, but that just means that everything that people desire is desirable, and that means that all the inhabitants of all the prisons in the world have been engaging in desirable conduct. There's a problem there. So you may ask, what about utilitarianism? Well, the problem is, although you may pursue pleasure, and many people do pursue pleasure, some people pursue other stuff. The question is, can the fact that many people pursue pleasure give you justification for making the claim that people ought to pursue pleasure, which I don't think follows. I think Hume has the better of that. That's why Mill goes out of his way to give us the crappiest argument of the 19th century. One of the things is I try and pick out the worst argument in every century. Right, like Descartes' hypothalamus position, where the spirit world comes into the meat and starts moving around. And that's genuinely preposterous. And so there's something, there's lots to be learned from bad arguments, right? And this is a problem here because it's not clear who has the better of this. There are people all over the world, actually throughout the history of our species, think 100,000 years ago, that probably had some sense of things you should do and things you shouldn't. They had some sense of taboos. Well, do they have a God? And if they have a God, does it have anything to do with Yahweh, or is it anything like Yahweh? Or what are we supposed to think about that? I don't know. It seems to me the ubiquity of something like the incest taboo suggests that there's some things that people tend to gravitate towards. Now, it may turn out, for biological reasons, that exogamy is actually useful to small groups, right? The endogamy means they're inbred and they die off because of inheritable diseases. So maybe it's just a selection process, you're right.
That in some ways is something that's so poisonous and so difficult if you want to preserve an idea of God about biology, which is that anything that stuck around, you can usually look back historically, and it is something attractive and say, well, why did this stick around? Okay, now do we need another reason that it's here?
Okay, that's interesting. One of the questions that I would raise, and it's an interesting question, because there's lots of ways you take it, but what is it that caused the rise of the great world religions? In other words, they all rise in the old world between, say, China and the Med, China, India, Mesopotamia, Persia, and the Med. They all emerge between, say, 1008 BC and the time of Christ. The question that I would, want to examine, why did they emerge? In other words, I assume that it means they're doing something similar in each of these cultures. What? Is religion necessary? If so, what is it necessary for? If it's not necessary, isn't it odd that all these cultures seem to be sprouting one?
The problem is that there's a how answer and a why answer.
I'll take both. I'm greedy.
Admirable. The how answer seems plausible enough, right? Which is to say, okay, how did these come about? Well, maybe there was an advantage to it, right? A society in which people have some purpose, have loyalty, and have ideas in their head that get them to act a particular way and outcompete or absorb other societies, well, they would still be here. It makes sense that they've gotten to where they are. When you get enough people in the right sort of place. It's almost like nuclear arms. It's like you reach a conventional arms point where you just can't build any more conventional bombs, and now if you want to stick around and you want to stay on top, you've got to keep pushing forward. That you could have an ideological arms race. That's a how. I mean, if you're asking a why,
I'll take either, yeah.
I don't know that I would say I have any expertise to give you a why, except to speculate theologically.
Well, it's a little bit like this. It turns out that for complicated multi-celled animals, respiration is really important. And different animals evolve different responses to this necessity. Some of them develop lungs, and on the basis of where they spend their lives, others develop gills because they spend their lives somewhere else. But it seems to me that what they're both doing is looking for a way to transfer energy from the external environment to the internal environment. Right? We're bringing in oxygen in both cases. One's out of the air and the other out of the water. Okay, my guess would be that the evolution of these things is they're both responding to a necessity, but necessities under different circumstances. But there's a certain kind of convergence here in the sense that you need that energy one way or another if you're going to have large multicellular animals.
Sure.
Okay? So both gills and lungs seem like they're a response to the same problem under different circumstances. I don't know. I mean, it seems like that's moving us in the direction of teleology. All right. On the other hand, there might be other ways to respond to this issue. In other words, maybe there's a special kind of respiration that they do on top of Mount Everest if there are microbes or something there, or multicellular animals that do it in a different way. So there seems to be some movement towards the solution of certain kinds of problems. How far along that line are we going to have to go before we start to discern teleology there? That's where it gets a little fuzzy for me. You got an answer? No way of getting in?
I don't think that historically, biologically, scientifically, you can ever bridge to teleology. You just, I'm afraid you have to kind of pull the Bible straight out of the mouth of God to get.
I think you're right. The current state of our sciences is, particularly biological sciences, is that they've given up on teleology, right? The actual practice of the discipline, right? They've given up on it. They take you, when you go to medical school, they'll tell you the different parts of the body and what, if you want a living body, it has to be doing. But they're going to say, look, that's not intrinsic to the thing, that's just the way this happens to work. It's a set of accidents, a concatenation of it. Okay. The same sort of thing with all the other domains of natural science, but also particularly other domains of biology. Evolutionary biologists that study, say, fish coming out of the water and going onto land, none of them ever ask, I wonder what the fish were thinking about when they decided to start wiggling on land. It doesn't matter, because the intentions of the fishes are irrelevant. It's not like fishes are doing their best to become land animals because somehow they need to be land animals, right? I don't think there's any biologist, or very few biologists, that would make a claim like that, right? Majority have said, look, it's the random result of genetic mutations, and there's no teleology in nature at all, right? And so that's the current state of the art. So I think your point is well taken, right? In other words, it may be that natural science someday will not hold that view, but currently that's the overwhelmingly dominant view.
If you want to see a response to that, there's a great book by a modern philosopher called Aristotle's Revenge, and it was a very important book for me, in that it convinced me that the Aristotelian tradition can survive in the modern world with the modern critique.
I mean, it would be very interesting. What characterizes modern natural science, and here I'm talking about the kind of the science that emerged between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, what that did was give up on teleology. All right?
For a variety of reasons.
That's true. That's true. All right? So, because they gave up on teleology, that's never been successfully reintroduced. That's what people like what the Discovery Institute out in Seattle are trying to do. They're trying to argue for intelligent design, that there's evidence in nature for it.
I dislike that.
It's completely hopeless. It's a dead end, right? In other words, look, use your intellectual ability and your energy for something that's actually going to work. This is not going to work, right? Because what it means is, what they're trying to do is go back to Aristotelian physics, or at least the Aristotelian teleology.
But the thing is that the modern Aristotelians don't like those guys either.
I don't blame them. I understand that. I mean, they're more subtle. Yeah. But the point is something like this. Modern evolutionary theory has jettisoned the idea of telos. Yes.
Like you read Bella, he points out that there's a resurgence of teleology and evolutionary biology.
It wouldn't surprise me.
For good reason.
Yeah. In other words, look, there are certain things, like the beating of the heart, where I don't have any problem with theology. It looks to me like if you want to be alive, you have to have your heart beat because it moves blood around. On the other hand, I don't know what you need to do with your earlobe. I can't even see a reason to believe that has an impact.
It's entirely compatible with an Aristotelian view of teleology to say that the earlobe is the result of chance.
Okay.
I can show you.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. Now we're going to be in the domain of separating out the necessary from the accidental. Good luck.
And the Aristotelian would say we'll never be completely certain, but there would be some where it's more strong or less strong that we can have a pretty clear judgment.
That's a plausible argument, actually. You know, I mean, there'll be a gray area, which would be difficult, but yeah, I mean, that makes pretty good sense to me.
It's a kind of phronesis.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm not as committed to rescuing Aristotle as you are, but I see that, you know, the advantages trying to do that. That makes sense. My difficulty with the Aristotelian tradition of physics is that it's been largely kicked out of science by the pros.
My problem with that is that is the result of not of scientific development, but of philosophical speculation in the Enlightenment, and that philosophical speculation asks the wrong questions.
That's interesting. Okay. Well, we'll come back to this because we're going to be visiting teleology quite a bit, I'm afraid. We're also going to be visiting science quite a bit. And, of course, the modern impasse of ethics. Is ethics even possible? With a God or without? Or is it just a question of random, spontaneous emotions? That's one conception of human nature and also one conception of human freedom. That's freedom as liberty. All right? The more rational conception is freedom as autonomy, which is not nearly as popular because it doesn't allow you to gratify your desires as much. We're in a pretty bad way in this culture. Dostoevsky wanted to know, Father, why should I love you? What's the answer? Would you love the elder Karamazov?
At the end, he addresses that it's not a matter of birth that you should only love him because it's your legitimate father, but there has to be, he talks about in order to be a good father, you have to be followed, you have to carry out your duty, and that there's much more to being a father than just natural birth.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah.
So why should I love my father? Or why should I love the elder Karamazov?
Because it's a duty.
It's a duty.
And because, as Zosima says, we're all responsible for everyone.
Yes, yes. That is Christian agape. That is the spirit of the law. That's an essential Christian doctrine. I'm not sure that it counts as a reason. Who has not wished for the death of his father? Any of you?
Yes.
Everybody has. No, I mean, look, when you're growing up, your parents are a pain in the ass, right? Because they restrict you, because you have teenage hormones running through you, and you need to be restricted. And so the best thing that can happen to you is that your parents restrict you, right? But most teenagers do not enjoy this, which is why they're so difficult to raise. Thank your parents someday for having gotten you through those years. Okay, so Father, why should I love you? And then even more important, who has not wished for the death of his father? That's not a rhetorical question. There's an answer. No. You're wrong.
Christ.
Yes. That's exactly right. He has not wished for the death of his father. So the answer to the big question is, yes, you guessed it. It's you know who. There we go. So,
Before we go, what do you think of the Grand Inquisitor?
No, I was going to say.
I was going to finish up with that. Grand Inquisitor is one of the most beautiful things I've ever written. Also one of the most disturbing things. Often in lame humanities classes, they just cut that out of the book and say you can't read the whole book. We're just going to give you this. Which gives you interesting stuff to talk about. It's just that it's not Dostoevsky's novel. The Grand Inquisitor is a creature of this world. He is in league with sin and human frailty. He is dispensing a false kind of charity. The charity of strictly enforced laws without religious authorization. Yeah,
He's a Machiavelli.
that's right.
Jean Valjean.
He is actually Ivan. That's why Ivan says it's really good for people to believe in God, because it keeps them quiet and they don't bother me. And given the choice, Ivan would turn into the Grand Inquisitor. But even in Ivan's story, we come to the limits of language. And when we reach the limits of what can be said, we then move into the domain of the things that can only be shown, not said. And Jesus kisses the Grand Inquisitor when he threatens him with death and destruction. And this so shakes the Grand Inquisitor that he lets him go and tells him to get out of here, don't ever come back. But then Alyosha kisses Ivan. And the problem is, there's no counter-argument to a kiss. It's like saying there's no response to laughter. There are words and there are things, and a kiss is a thing, not a word. So Ivan gives us all these cool, interesting ideas that are skeptical of religion. And Alyosha crushes these arguments by not making an argument. I give you the kiss of peace. It's the inverse of the Judas kiss that Jesus gets. One way of thinking of Alyosha is he's the anti-Judas. His brother is betraying himself, and he decides to unbetray him with a kiss. And strangely enough, Ivan is absolutely joyous at the response. He's happy and smiles at him and says, you know, that's not fair. You can't do that. That's not an argument. But he loves Alyosha because everybody loves Alyosha. And Alyosha does nothing but benevolent, kind things for people. And so he says, that's not an argument. I'll let it slide this time. Jesus and Alyosha win the day. And although Jesus has been banished, Alyosha's here. Strange that when you get rid of him, he boomerangs on back.
The kind of alternatives to Nietzsche.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's right. This is what you do with Nietzscheans. You just kill them with kindness. Drives them crazy. It does. I mean, they'll laugh at you for a while, but eventually they get tired of scoffing and they don't know what to do.
Nietzsche asked, why truth? And the answer is because of love.
Well, that's a beautiful, dubious answer.
Yes. I'm aware. Or because of yes.
Yeah. Why truth? Because of love. This goes back to what I was saying earlier, that the problem of the human condition, both as individuals and as a collective, is that there's an imperfect Venn diagram, an imperfect overlap between love and reason. This is the problem of our species. Think about the Odyssey when Odysseus does the flashback to the Iliad. Turns out that Astyanax, Hector's child, is still alive and he's like 3 or 4. And Odysseus sees what's going on and says, he's going to grow up and he's going to turn into something like his dad and he's going to come back for payback and he's going to kill every one of us. So the boy has to die. And and they all agree, and they take him up to the roof or to the walls of of Troy, and throw him down and kill him. What they're doing is reasoning their way into murdering a child. This is pertinent to our question that Augustine was thoughtful enough to propose for us. Is reason enough? I think it is not. Because there are some monstrous things that are perfectly reasonable. This is not unusual. Any of you have seen Godfather 2? What happens? They've killed the parents, they're going to kill the child. The logic is flawless. There's no problem in reasoning there. The problem is that it's an abomination. So we were hoping to be protected from abominations, and apparently reason will not do that. Which means we need something else. Which is why love is Trump. But there's a danger here. Love demands rational deployment. All right, you may have lots of love for people, but if you just throw money, say, if you throw $100 bills around rather than give them to people that are in need of them, right? That's exactly right. So this is a novel that bristles with problems and questions and interesting things to do with your brain. All right. It may be the product of some kind of organic mental illness, but I don't know where it comes from, and for my purpose, it doesn't matter. I don't care. It is one of the great landmarks of the 19th century. Next class, who's going to present next class? Nietzsche. Admirable. Okay. Now here's the deal. Oh, I'm sorry. If I kept too long. Please go ahead. I really didn't know we were gone. Please go ahead. Nietzsche.